The late autumn air already held a chill, but an unnatural cold snaked down David Saleh's spine as his shovel met a dull, yielding resistance deep within the gnarled roots of the ancient oak. This wasn't stone, nor the tough sinew of a forgotten root. With a growing sense of trepidation, he knelt, scraping away the clinging earth with his bare hands. His fingers brushed against something cool and unnervingly supple, decayed leather. Then a patch of color emerged, a muted, ghostly blue that stole the breath from his lungs. It was a color Harmony Creek had whispered about in hushed, fearful tones for a decade. A color tied to a silence that had never truly settled, now unearthed beneath his trembling fingertips. David Saleh navigated his existence in Harmony Creek with the quiet rhythm of a metronome. His days were a carefully orchestrated sequence of familiar comforts. The comforting scent of old paper and lemon polish at the town library, where he served as head librarian, the brief, polite exchanges at Mrs. Gable's bakery for his morning scone, the solitary evenings spent with a book in the worn armchair of his inherited Victorian home. This house, a relic of his grandparents' era, stood on the town's leafy fringe, its slightly peeling paint and sprawling, somewhat wild garden a testament to benign neglect rather than deliberate design. Its most imposing feature, a colossal oak tree, dominated the far end of the yard, its gnarled limbs a skeletal silhouette against the often gray Harmony Creek sky. David had always viewed it as a benign, ancient presence, a silent witness to generations. He had no inkling it was also a guardian of secrets, its roots entwined with a long-dormant tragedy. The 10th anniversary of Sarah Noor's vanishing was approaching, a date that invariably brought a subtle chill to Harmony Creek. It was a Saturday morning, crisp with the promise of autumn, when David, armed with a sturdy shovel and a rare surge of horticultural ambition, decided to finally address the unruly patch of earth beneath the oak. He envisioned a modest rock garden, perhaps a cluster of hostas and ferns that might thrive in the persistent shade. He worked steadily, the repetitive motion a balm to his usually overactive mind. Then the shovel's rhythmic cadence was broken. Not the jarring halt of a thick root or a buried stone, but a dull, oddly yielding resistance. Intrigued, David laid aside the shovel and knelt, brushing away the loose, loamy soil with his hands. His fingertips grazed a texture that was unexpectedly supple beneath the grime. Cool, slightly damp leather. As he cleared more earth, a patch of color, faded but unmistakably blue, emerged from the dark soil. A knot tightened in David's stomach. Even before it was fully exposed, an old, half-forgotten dread prickled his skin. The blue bag. Every long-term resident of Harmony Creek knew the legend. Sarah Noor, the vibrant, idealistic English teacher, new to town and full of plans, had been carrying a distinctive blue leather satchel on that ill-fated group holiday trip to the Blackwood Mountain Resort. The group, a collection of fellow teachers, school staff, and a few local community figures, had returned a week later shaken and incomplete. Sarah and her blue bag had vanished as if into the mountain mist itself. Searches, both official and volunteer, had combed the rugged terrain for weeks, finding nothing but an unnerving silence. The case had eventually withered, becoming a sorrowful footnote in Harmony Creek's otherwise placid history, a ghost story whispered to caution newcomers. His breath catching in his throat, David carefully, almost reverently, worked the satchel free from its 10-year entombment. It was heavier than he expected, sodden with moisture and caked with earth. For a long moment, he simply knelt there, the unearthed bag a tangible link to a decade-old mystery, its presence in his quiet garden a profound violation of the ordinary. The weight of its implications seemed to suck the air from his lungs. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached for his phone, the local police number, a number he'd never dialed in his 15 years of living alone in this house, feeling heavy and portentous on his screen. The arrival of Detective Lena Hansen from the county's Major Crimes Unit signaled that Sarah Knorr's disappearance was no longer just a local tragedy, but an active investigation once more. Hansen was a woman in her mid-40s, her demeanor a blend of no-nonsense professionalism and an unnervingly keen observational skill. Her gray eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in David, his anachronistic garden, the brooding oak, and the unearthed bag with equal, unreadable intensity. David, usually articulate, found himself stammering through his account of the discovery, acutely aware of how bizarre it must sound. Hansen listened without interruption. Her gaze occasionally drifted to the ancient tree, as if it too might offer testimony. A makeshift command post was soon established in David's yard, the quiet solitude shattered by the arrival of a forensics team. The contents of the blue bag were laid out on a sterile white sheet spread over David's rickety patio table. There was no wallet, no keys, no form of identification. Instead, the bag yielded a small, leather-bound journal, its pages warped and discolored by moisture, many fused into a solid, unreadable mass. There were a couple of slim volumes of poetry, Keats and Dickinson, David noted with a librarian's eye, their covers soft and pulpy. And then a single, faded photograph, protected somewhat by a plastic sleeve. It showed Sarah Knorr, her dark hair caught in a breeze, her arms slung casually around the shoulders of another smiling young woman. Sarah's smile in the photograph was radiant, achingly alive. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the grim tableau of her long-lost belongings and the chilling implication that her story, whatever it was, had ended somewhere close by. The mystery of Sarah Knorr, like the bag itself, had been exhumed, and David Sala, a man who cherished his quietude, was now standing squarely at its epicenter. The news of the blue bag's unearthing spread through Harmony Creek with the speed of a summer storm. It crackled along telephone wires, buzzed in the aisles of the grocery store, and became the hushed topic of conversation over coffee at Gable's Bakery. David Sala, accustomed to the comfortable anonymity of his librarian's life, found himself the reluctant focus of intense local curiosity. Neighbors he'd only ever exchanged polite nods with now paused by his fence, their expressions a mixture of morbid fascination and poorly concealed interrogation. He'd even caught Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over attempting to peer into his backyard with a pair of birdwatching binoculars. He deflected their inquiries with practiced, if slightly strained courtesy, retreating whenever possible to the ordered sanctuary of the Harmony Creek Public Library. Yet even there, amidst the comforting rustle of turning pages and the gentle click of keyboards, the whispers followed him. David Sala, you know, the librarian, found the bag right in his own yard. Detective Hansen, meanwhile, methodically began to pick at the cold, tangled threads of the 10-year-old case. She interviewed David again, more thoroughly this time, probing for any detail, however insignificant, about the history of his property, previous owners, or any unusual occurrences he might have dismissed. He could offer little beyond the mundane. The ancient oak, he explained, was reputed to be one of the oldest in the county, a local landmark in its own right. The bag had been buried deep within its root system, suggesting a deliberate, forceful act. Hansen spent hours poring over the original case files, a formidable stack of documents filled with witness statements, inconclusive forensic reports, and the fading hopes of a younger, less experienced investigative team. She noted the subtle, almost imperceptible discrepancies in the accounts provided by the various members of the ill-fated holiday group. Conflicting timelines of Sarah's last known movements, differing descriptions of her mood. David, despite his innate aversion to upheaval, found an unfamiliar restlessness stirring within him. The image of Sarah Knorr's bright smile in the faded photograph, contrasted with the grim reality of her unearthed belongings, pricked at his conscience. This wasn't just a local legend anymore, it was a tangible tragedy that had inexplicably found its way to his doorstep. He began his own quiet, parallel investigation, using the resources he knew best, the library's archives. He spent his lunch breaks and late evenings sifting through microfilmed copies of the Harmony Creek Chronicle from a decade ago. The initial headlines were bold and dramatic. Local teacher vanishes on mountain trip. Massive search underway for missing woman. Then, as weeks turned into months with no new leads, the articles grew smaller, less frequent, until Sarah Knorr's name faded from the front page, replaced by more current, less haunting news. He decided to seek out Mr. Arthur Jenkins, the retired school janitor. Mr. Jenkins, now in his late 70s, lived alone in a small, meticulously kept cottage filled with a lifetime's collection of knickknacks and the scent of pipe tobacco. He had been part of that holiday group, a chaperone of sorts. David found him tending his prize-winning roses. Over a surprisingly strong cup of black tea, Mr. Jenkins spoke of Sarah with a fond, melancholic smile. Ah, Sarah Knorr, a bright spark that one, full of life, always a kind word for everyone. A terrible shame, a terrible, terrible shame. His folksy charm was endearing, but David sensed a carefully guarded sorrow beneath the surface. There was a bit of an atmosphere, though,
There was a bit of an atmosphere on that trip, though, young David, Mr. Jenkins confided, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Not all sunshine and mountain air, if you catch my drift. Some undercurrents. He mentioned, vaguely, that Sarah had had a spirited disagreement with one of the male members of the group, something about differing philosophies. He couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on the individual or the specifics, his eyes clouding over. Old memories play tricks, you know. Back at the makeshift incident room, the forensics team had painstakingly managed to separate a few more pages from Sarah Knorr's water-damaged journal. The ink was faded, the paper fragile, but some entries were heartbreakingly legible. Detective Hansen, recognizing David's quiet intelligence and his unique position as the finder of the bag, shared a few photocopied excerpts. Sarah's handwriting was elegant, with distinctive, optimistic loops. One entry, penned just 2 days before she vanished, was particularly unsettling. The grandeur of these mountains is undeniable, yet I cannot shake this disquiet. A persistent feeling of being observed, a shadow just beyond the periphery. Perhaps it is merely the altitude or the lingering sting of M's betrayal. I told myself I would be strong, that I would see this through, but doubt is a creeping vine. M's betrayal. The phrase resonated with an ominous weight. Who was M, and what was the nature of this betrayal that had clearly wounded Sarah so deeply? The faded photograph found in the bag, the one of Sarah with the other smiling young woman, became Hansen's next focus. Cross-referencing it with the list of holiday group participants, she identified the other woman, Maria Elena Rodriguez, another teacher at Harmony Creek High at the time. Records showed Elena had resigned and moved out of state less than a year after Sarah's disappearance. Finding her, Hansen knew, might be key to deciphering Sarah's cryptic words. The blue bag, after a decade of silence, was slowly beginning to whisper its secrets, and the ancient roots of David's oak tree seemed to clutch them ever tighter. The task of locating Maria Elena Rodriguez after a decade proved challenging, but Detective Hansen was nothing if not persistent. Old-school records, forwarding addresses that led to dead ends, and countless phone calls finally led her to a quiet, sun-drenched cul-de-sac in a different state, a different life. Elena, now Maria Elena Thompson, a mother of 2 young children with laughter lines around her eyes that couldn't quite erase a lingering sadness, was understandably wary when Hansen contacted her. The past, she explained, was a door she had tried very hard to keep closed. But the news of the blue bag's discovery, the tangible proof that Sarah's story was not yet over, was a key she couldn't ignore. She agreed to a video interview, her face pale and strained as she sat before her laptop screen. "Sarah, She wasn't just a colleague. She was my dearest friend during that time in Harmony Creek, Elena began, her voice soft, laden with unshed tears. She had this incredible energy, this belief that she could make a difference. That student exchange program, it was her dream. She poured her heart and soul into fundraising for it, penned just 2 days before she vanished. Then she found out. Irregularities. Money that had been raised for the program, it wasn't all there. Significant amounts.
Who did she suspect, Elena? Hansen's voice was gentle but firm. Elena's gaze dropped. Mark Batten. The name landed with a thud. He was a history teacher then, very ambitious, very popular. He was the treasurer for the exchange program committee. Sarah found documents, ledgers, evidence. She kept it all in that blue bag. She was going to confront him more formally, present it to the school board as soon as we returned from the holiday. The M's betrayal from Sarah's journal entry now blazed with damning clarity. Why, Elena? Why didn't you tell anyone this 10 years ago? Hansen asked, the question hanging heavy in the virtual space between them. Elena's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. I was terrified, she choked out. Mark Batten, even then, he had connections. He was charming, people liked him. Harmony Creek, it's a small, tight-knit town. They protect their own. I was young, untenured, I had no power. After Sarah, after she disappeared, and he was part of the concerned search party, acting so distraught, I couldn't. I was afraid no one would believe me, or worse, that something would happen to me. So I left, I ran, and I've lived with that guilt ever since. Mark Batten, in the intervening decade, had indeed become a pillar of the Harmony Creek community. He was a successful entrepreneur, his name on several local businesses, a generous donor to civic causes, a man who exuded an aura of affable authority. When Detective Hansen requested an interview, he was the picture of civic-minded cooperation. He spoke of Sarah Noor with a carefully calibrated sadness, lauding her vibrant spirit and calling her disappearance a lasting tragedy for our town. He offered his full assistance to the investigation. Yet, when Hansen gently steered the conversation towards his role as treasurer for the exchange program or his specific interactions with Sarah during that final trip, Batten became noticeably evasive, his charm fraying slightly at the edges, his answers polished but hollow. The original investigator, former police chief Ben Carter, now a portly man enjoying his retirement by a nearby fishing lake, proved equally unhelpful. Over lukewarm coffee at a local diner, he patted Hansen's hand with an air of paternalistic condescension. Now, detective, he drawled, Sarah Noor was a sweet girl, no doubt, but sensitive, highly strung if you take my meaning. These artistic types, they can be flighty. Odds are she just got overwhelmed by life, maybe met someone new and decided to make a fresh start. That blue bag turning up after all this time, probably just some kids who found it and buried it for a lark years ago. I wouldn't go stirring up a hornet's nest with folks like Mark Batten if I were you. Solid citizen, Mark. His defense of Batten felt a little too robust, his dismissal of the case a little too convenient. David, meanwhile, found his own quiet existence increasingly unsettled. The late-night car idling at the end of his street had appeared twice more. A walk through the woods bordering his property had ended abruptly when he was sure he'd heard footsteps mirroring his own, only to find no one there. Was it his imagination, fueled by the grim discovery in his garden? Or was someone watching him, unnerved by what the blue bag might have revealed? His research into the history of his property had led him to a dusty, leather-bound volume in the library's local history section, Folklore and Landmarks of Harmony County. It was there he found the reference to the ancient oak in his yard. Decades prior, before his grandparents had even owned the land, it was known colloquially as the Lover's Oak. Young couples, the book described, would meet beneath its branches, carving their initials into its bark, sometimes burying small tokens of their affection, time capsules of whispered promises, within its sprawling root system. David showed the passage to Detective Hansen. The incongruity was stark. Why would someone dispose of incriminating evidence at a place with such romantic, almost sacred local connotations? It felt wrong. Too sentimental for a cold-blooded act. Hansen agreed. The narrative of a panicked Mark Batten simply dumping the bag to hide embezzlement evidence didn't quite align with the peculiar choice of burial site. Something was missing. Acting on this shared unease, she authorized a more extensive and meticulous excavation around the base of the oak tree, extending several feet out from where David had found the bag. The forensic team worked with painstaking care, using small trowels and brushes, sifting every handful of soil. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across David's yard, when one of the technicians, a young woman named Chen, let out a small, sharp gasp. All activity ceased. Chen, her face pale, pointed to a spot nestled deep amongst a particularly thick cluster of roots. Partially unearthed was a small, rectangular object, dark with corrosion. It was a metal box, no bigger than a book. With bated breath, they watched as it was carefully extricated and opened. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like rotted velvet, lay a tarnished silver locket, its surface etched with a barely discernible, ornate S. Beside it, miraculously preserved, was a single, pressed blue forget-me-not flower. The discovery of the small metal box, with its intimately personal contents, shifted the emotional gravity of the investigation. The tarnished silver locket and the delicate pressed forget-me-not spoke not of embezzlement or a panicked cover-up, but of something far more personal, perhaps even tender. When Detective Hansen showed a photograph of the locket to Elena Rodriguez via another video call, Elena's breath hitched. That's Sarah's," she whispered, tears instantly welling. "It was her grandmother's. She never, ever took it off." The forget-me-not, Elena confirmed, was Sarah's favorite flower. She often tucked pressed ones into the books she was reading. The careful, almost reverent way these items had been buried, in their own separate container, so close to where the blue bag lay hidden, deepened the mystery and complicated any simple theory of Mark Batten's guilt. Armed with this new, poignant evidence, Detective Hansen decided it was time for another conversation with Mr. Arthur Jenkins. She found the retired janitor in his sun-dappled garden, his usual chipper demeanor noticeably absent. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped. Hansen didn't begin with accusations. She spoke quietly of Sarah, of the locket, of the forget-me-not. She laid photographs of the items on the small wrought iron table between them. Mr. Jenkins stared at the images, his weathered hands trembling visibly. The carefully constructed dam of his composure, held fast for 10 long years, finally began to crack. "The locket," he murmured, his voice raspy. "She was always fiddling with it." Hansen waited, her silence more potent than any question. Then the story, the terrible burden he had carried alone for a decade, began to spill out. Hesitant at first, then gaining a desperate momentum. "It was Mark Batten," he admitted, the name a heavy stone in his mouth. "He and Sarah, they were always intense. That last day on the trip, they had a terrible row, up on Miller's Ridge, away from the rest of us. I saw them from a distance, voices raised, gestures sharp. It wasn't just about the school funds, Detective, I could tell. It was personal, like a fire between them." Later that evening, Jenkins recounted, a frantic Mark Batten had sought him out, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that Jenkins had never forgotten. He was rambling, incoherent at first. Then he said Sarah was gone. An accident, he kept saying. They'd argued again, up on the ridge. She'd gotten too close to the edge, he said, slipped. He tried to catch her, but she fell. He swore it was an accident, that he never meant for any harm to come to her. Jenkins paused, wiping his eyes with a shaky hand. He was a mess, panicked about his career, his reputation, what people would say if they knew he was the last one with her, especially with the rumors about the exchange program money already starting to whisper. He begged me to help him, said no one would ever believe it was an accident. And so, under the cloak of a moonless mountain night, a terrified Arthur Jenkins helped a distraught Mark Batten carry Sarah Knorr's lifeless body to a shallow, hastily dug grave in a remote, rocky outcrop of the forest near the resort. Mark had taken her blue bag. He said he'd get rid of it later, that it had things in it that could be misunderstood, Jenkins choked out. He seemed genuinely devastated, Detective, not like a man who just committed murder, but like someone whose world had just ended. He kept muttering her name. That's why I believed him. I kept his secret. Jenkins' confession explained the initial burial, the panic, the blue bag, but it didn't explain the lover's oak, the carefully buried locket, or the forget-me-not. Jenkins knew nothing of these. His involvement had ended on that terrible night in the mountains. The blue bag, containing the embezzlement evidence, was indeed a threat Mark needed to neutralize. Burying it on a quiet, somewhat forgotten property on the edge of town, a place he might have known from his youth or through a casual acquaintance with a previous owner, seemed plausible for a man trying to distance himself from incriminating evidence. But the locket, the flower, those spoke of a different emotion, a different actor. David, listening to Hansen relay Jenkins' harrowing account, felt a cold clarity descend. He recalled the old archive photograph of the holiday group, the almost palpable tension in the way Mark Batten and Sarah Knorr had stood apart, yet seemed inextricably linked by an unseen current. He remembered Mr. Jenkins' earlier vague mention of a disagreement over values that felt like more than just money. The lover's oak. Detective Hansen, too, sensed that another layer of the story remained hidden. She revisited the profiles of the other group members, looking for someone with a less obvious connection, perhaps someone who had harbored unspoken feelings or observed more than they let on. Her attention settled on Laura Benson. Laura had been Sarah's roommate on the trip, a quiet, introspective woman, described by others as a dreamer, someone often lost in the pages of a book. She had been deeply distressed by Sarah's disappearance, but had offered little concrete information during the initial investigation. When Hansen and David approached Laura Benson at her small cottage, surrounded by an impeccably kept flower garden, she initially appeared composed, offering them tea with a nervous flutter of her hands. But as Hansen gently guided the conversation towards Sarah, towards Mark Batten, towards the deep emotional currents of that fateful trip, Laura's composure began to fray. She twisted a handkerchief in her lap, her gaze darting around the room, avoiding theirs. When Hansen finally showed her the photographs of the locket and the forget-me-not, Laura let out a small, wounded cry and collapsed into sobs. The confession that followed was whispered, fragmented, imbued with a decade of hoarded guilt and romantic delusion. Laura had secretly, hopelessly adored Mark Batten from afar. She had seen, or thought she'd seen, a special, albeit troubled connection between Mark and Sarah. They were like characters in a tragic romance, she wept. So much passion, so much pain. After the group returned to Harmony Creek, reeling from Sarah's vanishing, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She'd been haunted by a distraught, half-muttered comment Mr. Jenkins had made in the confusing aftermath about poor Sarah alone in those cold woods. Weeks later, driven by a morbid curiosity and a strange romanticized grief, Laura had returned to the Blackwood Mountain area alone. She'd searched for days, driven by an almost preternatural instinct. I felt I had to find her, to know, she explained. She eventually stumbled upon the poorly concealed, shallow grave. It was horrific, but I didn't believe Mark had murdered her. not in cold blood. I convinced myself it had to be a terrible accident, like he'd told Mr. Jenkins, that he loved her too much to hurt her intentionally, and his heart was broken. In a profoundly misguided act, fueled by her romantic fantasies and a desire to give Sarah a beautiful, secret resting place, Laura had single-handedly, over several clandestine, arduous trips, exhumed Sarah's remains. She brought them back to Harmony Creek. She chose the Lover's Oak, a place she knew Sarah had once sketched and admired for its serene beauty, as a secret, sacred shrine. She had carefully placed Sarah's locket, which she'd found still clasped around her neck, and the pressed forget-me-not, one Sarah had given her from her own collection, into the small metal box she'd bought at an antique store, burying it tenderly with Sarah. Sometime later, Mark Batten, looking drawn and haunted, had approached Laura. He spoke vaguely of some old papers of Sarah's, things that were too painful for him to keep, that needed to be put to rest. Still caught in her web of romantic delusion, believing she was helping a grieving man protect his beloved's memory, Laura had suggested the spot beneath the Lover's Oak. She had helped him bury the blue bag there, never once looking inside, never suspecting she was aiding in the concealment of evidence, unknowingly weaving the final, tragic threads into a decade-long mystery. The interwoven confessions of Arthur Jenkins and Laura Benson, stark in their sorrow and regret, tightened the net around Mark Batten. Presented with their testimonies, the physical evidence of the blue bag and its incriminating contents, and the undeniable emotional weight of the locket and flower, Batten's veneer of civic respectability finally shattered. He didn't confess to murder. He clung fiercely to the narrative of a tragic accident, a heated argument on a treacherous cliff edge, a misstep, Sarah's horrified cry as she fell. His subsequent actions, however, from enlisting Jenkins' help in the dead of night to bury her body, to the calculated disposal of the blue bag, to his decade of carefully constructed deceit, painted a clear picture of a man prioritizing self-preservation above all else. He was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter, embezzlement of school funds, and multiple counts of obstruction of justice. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek, a town that had long regarded him as a benefactor and leader. His downfall was as swift as it was public. Laura Benson, her face a mask of bewildered grief, faced charges for her role in illegally disturbing Sarah's remains and concealing evidence. Her lawyer argued passionately about her fragile emotional state, her profound naivete, and her lack of malicious intent, painting her as another victim of Batten's manipulations and her own romanticized view of the world. The courts would grapple with the nuances of her culpability. Arthur Jenkins, frail and visibly broken by the unburdening of his long-held secret, cooperated fully with the authorities. His age, his evident remorse, and the extent of Mark Batten's manipulation were taken into account, suggesting he might receive a significantly lesser charge, or perhaps even immunity, in exchange for his unwavering testimony. With the truth finally, painfully brought to light, Sarah Noor's remains were respectfully exhumed from their secret resting place beneath the Lover's Oak. The town of Harmony Creek, shamed by the secrets it had unknowingly harbored, organized a formal memorial service. It was a somber affair, attended by current and former students, colleagues, and residents who remembered the vibrant young teacher. Elena Rodriguez flew in from out of state, her presence a poignant bridge to Sarah's past. Standing before a newly erected headstone in the Harmony Creek Cemetery, finally bearing Sarah Noor's name and dates, Elena wept openly, a mingling of sorrow for her lost friend and a small, hard-won measure of peace. For David Sala, the rhythms of his life had been irrevocably altered. His quiet garden, the ancient oak tree, the very foundations of his inherited home were now steeped in a history far deeper and more sorrowful than he could ever have imagined. The unearthing of the blue bag had been like pulling a single thread that unraveled a complex, dark tapestry of human frailty, deceit, and misguided love. He found he could no longer retreat into the comfortable cocoon of his books and his solitude. The mystery had ignited a spark within him, a reluctant but undeniable connection to the intricate, often hidden stories of the people and places around him. He began to spend more time away from the library's hushed stacks, volunteering at the small, underfunded Harmony Creek Historical Society. He found a quiet satisfaction in sifting through old documents, cataloging photographs, and piecing together the fragmented narratives of the town's past, driven by a newfound understanding that every life, every place, held stories worthy of being told, of being remembered. Detective Lena Hansen, her work in Harmony Creek concluded, stopped by David's house before leaving town. "You know, Mr. Sala," she said, offering a rare, tired smile, "your observations, that bit about the Lover's Oak, it opened a door we might never have found. You helped give Sarah Noor her voice back after all these years." The following spring, when the first crocuses pushed through the thawing earth, David bought a packet of forget-me-not seeds. He cleared a small patch of ground near the base of the ancient oak tree, the earth there still softer than the surrounding soil. As he pressed the tiny seeds into the dirt, he thought of Sarah Noor, of Laura Benson's tragic romanticism, of Arthur Jenkins' heavy burden, and of Mark Batten's ruinous choices. The blue bag, a forgotten relic beneath the roots, had brought forth a painful, complicated truth. But with truth, however sorrowful, came a chance for reckoning, and perhaps, in time, for a different kind of harmony in Harmony Creek.